Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2021 edition of Socialism for All. And this is an audiobook of Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany from 1952 by Friedrich Engels. This audiobook is being recorded in a collaborative fashion as part of S4A Community Project Number 1 by members of the S4A community who are each going to be contributing one chapter to this project. Please follow the associated playlist to hear the whole work. Let's also just take a moment to thank the current patrons whose names are on the screen for their contributions and for helping to support this channel. So, on to the front matter. So, Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany was written in 1851 to 1852. It was first published October 1851 to October 1852 in the New York Daily Tribune. It was published in book form, edited by Eleanor Marx Aveling, 1896. The source is MECW, Volume 11, pages 3 to 91. Transcription and markup by Sally Ryan, 1999. Proofed and corrected by Mark Harris, 2010. So let's get into the audiobook. This is Chapter 1, Germany at the Outbreak of the Revolution. October 25, 1851. The first act of the revolutionary drama on the continent of Europe has closed. The powers that were, before the hurricane of 1848, are again the powers that be, and the more or less popular rulers of a day, provisional governors, triumvirs, dictators with their tail of representatives, civil commissioners, military commissioners, prefects, judges, generals, officers, and soldiers, are thrown upon foreign shores and transported beyond the seas to England or America, there to form new governments in partibus infidelium, European committees, central committees, national committees, and to announce their advent with proclamations quite as solemn as those of any less imaginary potentates. A more signal defeat than that undergone by the Continental Revolutionary Party, or rather parties, upon all points of the line of battle cannot be imagined. But what of that? Has not the struggle of the British middle classes for their social and political supremacy embraced 48, that of the French middle classes 40 years of unexampled struggles? And was their triumph ever nearer than at the very moment when restored monarchy thought itself more firmly settled than ever? The times of that superstition, which attributed revolutions to the ill will of a few agitators, have long passed away. Everyone knows nowadays that wherever there is a revolutionary convulsion, there must be some social want in the background, which is prevented by outworn institutions from satisfying itself. Quick comment. I think some people in the U.S., conservatives, are still struggling with that idea. They're just troublemakers. No. It is some social want in the background. All right, continuing. The want may not yet be felt as strongly, as generally, as might ensure immediate success, but every attempt at forcible repression will only bring it forth stronger and stronger until it bursts its fetters. If then we have been beaten, we have nothing else to do but to begin again from the beginning. And, fortunately, the probably very short interval of rest which is allowed us between the close of the first and the beginning of the second act of the movement gives us time for a very necessary piece of work, the study of the causes that necessitated both the late outbreak and its defeat, causes that are not to be sought for in the accidental efforts, talents, faults, errors, or treacheries of some of the leaders, but in the general social state and conditions of existence of each of the convulsed nations. That the sudden movements of February and March 1848 were not the work of single individuals, but spontaneous, irresistible manifestations of national wants and necessities, more or less clearly understood, but very distinctly felt by numerous classes in every country, is a fact recognized everywhere. But when you inquire into the causes of the counter-revolutionary successes, there you are met on every hand with the ready reply that it was Mr. This or Citizen That who, quote, betrayed the people. Which reply may be very true or not according to circumstances, but under no circumstances does it explain anything, not even show how it came to pass that the people allowed themselves to be thus betrayed. And what a poor chance stands a political party whose entire stock in trade consists in a knowledge of the solitary fact that citizen so-and-so is not to be trusted. Quick comment there. We've talked a lot on this channel about Bernie Sanders, who certainly, we would say betrayed the people, did some very obvious things, kowtowing to the Democratic, corporatist line when he was supposedly separate from that. We'll come back to that in a while. But certainly there is a great deal of fear, lack of commitment. I don't know what else to say in the U.S. working class. There's a strong sense of defeat. I mean, a lot of people have just given up and, have kind of withdrawn into this very depressed, anxious, tense, sort of reality-denying cocoon. I wonder if, people are going to start popping out of that more and more. Anyway, well, we're just getting started, so we'll come back to that. Continuing. The inquiry into and exposition of the causes, both of the revolutionary convulsion and its suppression, are, besides, of paramount importance from a historical point of view. All these petty personal quarrels and recriminations, all these contradictory assertions that it was Marrast or Ledru-Rollin or Louis Blanc or any other member of the provisional government, or the whole of them, that steered the revolution amidst the rocks upon which it foundered, of what interest can they be, what light can they afford, to the Englishman or American who observed all these various movements from a distance too great to allow of his distinguishing any of the details of operations? No man in his senses will ever believe that 11 men, mostly of very indifferent capacity, either for good or evil, were able in 3 months to ruin a nation of 36 millions, unless those 36 millions saw as little of their way before them as the 11 did. But how it came to pass that 36 millions were at once called upon to decide for themselves which way to go, although partly groping in dim twilight, and how then they got lost and their old leaders were for a moment allowed to return to their leadership, that is just the question. If, then, we try to lay before the readers of the Tribune the causes which, while they necessitated the German Revolution of 1848, led quite as inevitably to its momentary repression in 1849 and 1850, we shall not be expected to give a complete history of events as they passed in that country. Later events, and the judgment of coming generations, will decide what portion of that confused mass of seemingly accidental, incoherent, and incongruous facts is to form a part of the world's history. The time for such a task has not yet arrived. We must confine ourselves to the limits of the possible and be satisfied if we can find rational causes based upon undeniable facts to explain the chief events, the principal vicissitudes of that movement, and to give us a clue as to the direction which the next, and perhaps not very distant, outbreak will impart to the German people. And firstly, what was the state of Germany at the outbreak of the Revolution? The composition of the different classes of the people, which form the groundwork of every political organization, was in Germany more complicated than in any other country. While in England and France, feudalism was entirely destroyed, or at least reduced, as in the former country, to a few insignificant forms, by a powerful and wealthy middle class, concentrated in large towns, and particularly in the capital. The feudal nobility in Germany had retained a great portion of their ancient privileges. The feudal system of tenure was prevalent almost everywhere. The lords of the land had even retained the jurisdiction over their tenants. Deprived of their political privileges, of the right to control the princes, they had preserved almost all their medieval supremacy over the peasantry of their demesnes, as well as their exemption from taxes. Feudalism was more flourishing in some localities than in others, but nowhere except on the left bank of the Rhine was it entirely destroyed. This feudal nobility, then extremely numerous and partly very wealthy, was considered officially the first order in the country. It furnished the higher government officials. It almost exclusively officered the army. The bourgeoisie of Germany was by far not as wealthy and concentrated as that of France or England. The ancient manufactures of Germany had been destroyed by the introduction of steam and the rapidly extending supremacy of English manufacturers. The more modern manufactures started under the Napoleonic continental system, established in other parts of the country, did not compensate for the loss of the old ones, nor suffice to create a manufacturing interest strong enough to force its wants upon the notice of governments jealous of every extension of non-noble wealth and power. If France carried her silk manufactures victorious through 50 years of revolutions and wars, Germany, during the same time, all but lost her ancient linen trade. The manufacturing districts, besides, were few and far between, situated far inland, and using mostly foreign, Dutch, or Belgian ports for their imports and exports. They had little or no interest in common with the large seaport towns on the North Sea and the Baltic. They were, above all, unable to create large manufacturing and trading centers such as Paris and Lyon, London and Manchester. The causes of this backwardness of German manufactures were manifold, but two will suffice to account for it: the unfavorable geographical situation of the country, at a distance from the Atlantic, which had become the great highway for the world's trade, and the continuous wars in which Germany was involved, and which were fought on her soil from the 16th century to the present day. It was this want of numbers, and particularly of anything like concentrated numbers, which prevented the German middle classes from attaining that political supremacy which the English bourgeoisie has enjoyed ever since 1688, and which the French conquered in 1789. And yet, ever since 1815, the wealth, and with the wealth, the political importance of the middle class in Germany was continually growing. Governments were, although reluctantly, compelled to bow, at least to its more immediate material interests. It may even truly be said that from 1815 to 1830, and from 1832 to 1840, every particle of political influence which, having been allowed to the middle class in the constitutions of the smaller states, was again wrested from them during the above two periods of political reaction, that every such particle was compensated for by some more practical advantage allowed to them. Every political defeat of the middle class drew after it a victory on the field of commercial legislation, and certainly the Prussian protective tariff of 1818 and the formation of the Zollverein were worth a good deal more to the traders and manufacturers of Germany than the equivocal right of expressing in the chambers of some diminutive dukedom their want of confidence in ministers who laughed at their votes. Thus, with growing wealth and extending trade, the bourgeoisie soon arrived at a stage where it found the development of its most important interests checked by the political constitution of the country, by its random division among the 36 princes with conflicting tendencies and caprices, by the feudal fetters upon agriculture and the trade connected with it, by the prying superintendence to which an ignorant and presumptuous bureaucracy subjected all its transactions. At the same time, the extension and consolidation of the Zollverein, the general introduction of steam communication, the growing competition in the home trade, brought the commercial classes of the different states and provinces closer together, equalized their interests, and centralized their strength. The natural consequence was the passing of the whole mass of them into the camp of the liberal opposition, and the gaining of the first serious struggle of the German middle class for political power. This change may be dated from 1840, from the moment when the bourgeoisie of Prussia assumed the lead of the middle class movement of Germany. We shall hereafter revert to this liberal opposition movement of 1840 to 1847. The great mass of the nation, which neither belonged to the nobility nor to the bourgeoisie, consisted in the towns of the small trading and shopkeeping class and the working people, and in the country of the peasantry. The small trading and shopkeeping class is exceedingly numerous in Germany, in consequence of the stinted development which the large capitalists and manufacturers as a class have had in that country. In the larger towns it forms almost the majority of the inhabitants. In the smaller ones it entirely predominates, from the absence of wealthier competitors or influence. This class, a most important one, in every modern body politic and in all modern revolutions, is still more important in Germany, where, during the recent struggles, it generally played the decisive part. Its intermediate position between the class of larger capitalists, traders, and manufacturers, the bourgeoisie properly so called, and the proletarian or industrial class, determines its character. Aspiring to the position of the first, the least adverse turn of fortune hurls the individuals of this class down into the ranks of the second. In monarchical and feudal countries, the custom of the court and aristocracy becomes necessary to its existence. The loss of this custom might ruin a great part of it. In the smaller towns, a military garrison, a county government, a court of law with its followers, form very often the base of its prosperity. Withdraw these, and down go the shopkeepers, the tailors, the shoemakers, the joiners. Thus eternally tossed about between the hope of entering the ranks of the wealthier class and the fear of being reduced to the state of proletarians or even paupers, between the hope of promoting their interests by conquering a share in the direction of public affairs, and the dread of rousing, by ill-timed opposition, the ire of a government which disposes of their very existence, because it has the power of removing their best customers. Possessed of small means, the insecurity of the possession of which is in the inverse ratio of the amount, this class is extremely vacillating in its views. Humble and crouchingly submissive under a powerful feudal or monarchical government, it turns to the side of liberalism when the middle class is in the ascendant. It becomes seized with violent democratic fits as soon as the middle class has secured its own supremacy, but it falls back into the abject despondency of fear as soon as the class below itself, the proletarians, attempts an independent movement. We shall by and by see this class, in Germany, pass alternately from one of these stages to the other. The working class in Germany is, in its social and political development, as far behind that of England and France as the German bourgeoisie is behind the bourgeoisie of those countries. Like master, like man. The evolution of the conditions of existence for a numerous, strong, concentrated, and intelligent proletarian class goes hand in hand with the development of the conditions of existence for a numerous, wealthy, concentrated, and powerful middle class. The working class movement itself never is independent, never is of an exclusively proletarian character, until all the different factions of the middle class, and particularly its most progressive faction, the large manufacturers, have conquered political power and remodeled the state according to their wants. It is then that the inevitable conflict between the employer and the employed becomes imminent and cannot be adjourned any longer, that the working class can no longer be put off with delusive hopes and promises never to be realized, that the great problem of the 19th century, the abolition of the proletariat, is at last brought forward fairly and in its proper light. Now, in Germany, the mass of the working class were employed, not by those modern manufacturing lords of which Great Britain furnishes such splendid specimens, but by small tradesmen, whose entire manufacturing system is a mere relic of the Middle Ages. And as there is an enormous difference between the great cotton lord and the petty cobbler or master tailor, so there is a corresponding distance from the wide-awake factory operative of modern manufacturing Babylons to the bashful journeyman tailor or cabinet maker of a small country town, who lives in circumstances and works after a plan very little different from those of the like sort of men some 500 years ago. This general absence of modern conditions of life, of modern modes of industrial production, of course was accompanied by a pretty equally general absence of modern ideas, and it is therefore not to be wondered at if, at the outbreak of the Revolution, a large part of the working classes should cry out for the immediate reestablishment of guilds and medieval privileged trades corporations. Yet from the manufacturing districts where the modern system of production predominated, and in consequence of the facilities of intercommunication and mental development afforded by the migratory life of a large number of the working men, a strong nucleus formed itself, whose ideas about the emancipation of their class were far clearer and more in accordance with existing facts and historical necessities. But they were a mere minority. If the active movement of the middle class may be dated from 1840, that of the working class commences its advent by the insurrections of the Silesian and Bohemian factory operatives in 1844, and we shall soon have occasion to pass in review the different stages through which this movement passed. Lastly, there was the great class of the small farmers, the peasantry, which, with its appendix of farm laborers, constitutes a considerable majority of the entire nation. But this class again subdivided itself into different fractions. There were firstly the more wealthy farmers, what is called in Germany Gross and Mittelbauern, proprietors of more or less extensive farms, and each of them commanding the services of several agricultural laborers. This class, placed between the large, untaxed feudal landowners and the smaller peasantry and farm laborers, for obvious reasons, found in an alliance with the anti-feudal middle class of the towns its most natural political course. Then there were, secondly, the small freeholders, predominating in the Rhine country, where feudalism had succumbed before the mighty strokes of the Great French Revolution. Similar independent small freeholders also existed here and there in other provinces, where they had succeeded in buying off the feudal charges formerly due upon their lands. This class, however, was a class of freeholders by name only, their property being generally mortgaged to such an extent and under such onerous conditions that not the peasant, but the usurer who had advanced the money, was the real landowner. Thirdly, the feudal tenants, who could not be easily turned out of their holdings, but who had to pay a perpetual rent, or to perform in perpetuity a certain amount of labor in favor of the lord of the manor. Lastly, the agricultural laborers, whose condition in many large farming concerns was exactly that of the same class in England, and who in all cases lived and died poor, ill-fed, and the slaves of their employers. These three latter classes of the agricultural population, the small freeholders, the feudal tenants, and the agricultural laborers, never troubled their heads much about politics before the Revolution, but it is evident that this event must have opened to them a new career, full of brilliant prospects. To every one of them, the Revolution offered advantages, and the movement, once fairly engaged in, it was expected that each, in their turn, would join it. But at the same time, it is quite as evident, and equally borne out by the history of all modern countries, that the agricultural population, in consequence of its dispersion over a great space, and of the difficulty of bringing about an agreement among any considerable portion of it, never can attempt a successful independent movement. They require the initiatory impulse of the more concentrated, more enlightened, more easily moved people of the towns. The preceding short sketch of the most important of the classes, which in their aggregate formed the German nation at the outbreak of the recent movements, will already be sufficient to explain a great part of the incoherence, incongruence, and apparent contradiction which prevailed in that movement. When interests so varied, so conflicting, so strangely crossing each other, are brought into violent collision, when these contending interests in every district, every province, are mixed in different proportions, when above all there's no great center in the country, no London, no Paris, the decisions of which, by their weight, may supersede the necessity of fighting out the same quarrel over and over again in every single locality, what else is to be expected but that the contest will dissolve itself into a mass of unconnected struggles, in which an enormous quantity of blood, energy, and capital is spent, but which, for all that, remain without any decisive results. The political dismemberment of Germany into 36 of more or less important principalities is equally explained by this confusion and multiplicity of the elements which compose the nation, and which again vary in every locality. Where there are no common interests, there can be no unity of purpose, much less of action. The German Confederation, it is true, was declared everlastingly indissoluble, yet the Confederation and its organ, the Diet, never represented German unity. The very highest pitch to which centralization was ever carried in Germany was the establishment of the Zollverein. By this, the states on the North Sea were also forced into a customs union of their own, Austria remaining wrapped up in her separate prohibitive tariff. Germany had the satisfaction to be, for all practical purposes, divided between 3 independent powers only, instead of between 36. Of course, the paramount supremacy of the Russian Tsar, as established in 1814, underwent no change on this account. Having drawn these preliminary conclusions from our premises, we shall see in our next how the aforesaid various classes of the German people were set into movement one after the other, and what character the movement assumed on the outbreak of the French Revolution of 1848. London, September 1851. And that is the end of Chapter 1 of Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany by Friedrich Engels, 1852. Before I pass it off to the next reader to pick up Chapter 2, I just want to comment on Chapter 1. So Engels clearly is laying out, the distinction between when analyzing a historical upheaval like a revolution or, uprising, whatever, not to just look at personalities and, quote unquote, conspiratorial events, the actions of a few people. While these sometimes can have an influence, you have to look overall at the class composition and the trajectory of each of those classes within the country, because those determine the material interests that everybody is going to be fighting for. Of course, the different classes' ability to recognize their own interests is also important. But assuming that a majority of, members of each class somewhat recognize their own interests and are pushing for them, that's key, as well as other situations like, as he was mentioning, the fact that Germany had no commanding capital which exerted strong influence throughout the rest of the country. It was not a well-unified country, so each little region was sort of having its own apparently unconnected struggle, sort of reinventing the wheel over and over again rather than doing it on a unified national basis. If that sounds like the United States today to you, it does to me as well, so you're not alone. This is a challenge. The United States, obviously much larger than Germany. Of course, technology, you could say, somewhat binds us, and transportation technology as well, as communication technology, binds us together into some sort of unity, maybe proportionally to, the size of Germany, to the size of the United States, and then Germany in the 1850s, United States to today. But I think that those are also issues. So I guess the point here to conclude on is, for anybody trying to understand what's going on in the U.S. today, yes, the machinations of particular politicians at times can, give a decisive turn to this or that. But if you're really trying to understand the overall trajectory and make any kind of, predictions, or just have any kind of grounded understanding of the overall flow of events and want to speak about that intelligently, this is the kind of analysis that you need to do, the kind that he's laying out here. And we will see what else he lays out in the remaining 19 chapters of this work, and I will hand it off to the next reader. Thanks for listening, and please pick up the next entry in the playlist.